we have our next guest, and this is Lizzie O'Shea. Now, Lizzie is founder and chair of Digital Rights Watch. I'm scared to look at Digital Rights Watch. It's dealing with tough issues, and it's so wonderful to have her as a champion for all of us. She's on the board of several things. She tackles gambling reform. She tackles harassment of staff and patients in all sorts of clinics, and she takes on the issues of a traditional Aboriginal owner. And she's one of the bravest people I know. She's written an incredible book, Future Histories. And it's so great to have you here today, Lizzie, to kick us off with a chat.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nigel. I'm just going to figure out exactly how to share the screen. While I attempt to do that, I'll tell you that my conference name is actually Lasagna Meow. So I was thinking that that's actually sort of sounds like to me the kind of a kind of band I might start with Garfield. So if anybody else wants to be in that band, please feel free to join me. So I'll just wait to check with you, Nigel. I assume everyone can see my slide. But someone I'm sure will interrupt me if that's not the case. Wonderful. My setup is nowhere near as sophisticated, I must say, as Scott's, and involves stacks of books and the like, because I'm not a tech person. So hopefully everything stays standing. But I wanted to start by acknowledging that I come to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and that sovereignty was never ceded. And I am so excited to be here speaking with you today. And I'm really grateful that Thoughtworks has made space for these kinds of discussions, that discussions about technology are not just discussions about technological expertise, but also how technology integrates into our social systems. And this kind of discussion is very important and involves cross-disciplinary skills. So you'll always need very good engineers and designers to build great tech, and I'm not one of those. But to build great tech, it also involves thinking through how humans behave and engage with each other. And I think that requires skills from outside the technological community, which is why I'm really honoured to be here as a practicing lawyer and historian and writer and activist. The theme of hostile tech, it got me thinking. It's really interesting because, like many lawyers, I really like defining terms very specifically. And it invited me to wonder what actually constitutes hostile tech. It's a term that often makes us think of protecting innocent users from criminals and other nefarious actors, from unintended users of technology. And the question becomes, how do we avoid people using password 123? How do we make sure they don't accidentally give network access to the wrong people? How do we avoid unauthorized users hijacking our systems? The question becomes, what risk does hostile tech pose to our project? And the threat model that's applied in the course of design imagines hostile actors as external to the relationship between users and makers of technology. But I think there's another way to think about hostile tech, and that is that tech can be hostile when it works exactly as it's supposed to. But sometimes the objective of technology is actually actively hostile to the users of that technology or the people that it's used upon. And I'm thinking about tech that works to kick people off welfare, tech that encourages people to stay on device, tech that measures productivity in micro increments, tech that optimizes weaponry, that turns people into a worse version of themselves. This kind of tech is hostile if you are a person that it's used on or used against. And so I'd argue that if we are to think critically about how technology can be hostile, we first need to start thinking about power. Who has decision-making power about how tech is built and used? Who holds power and who is interested in holding power accountable? Who might be harmed by a technology and who cares? And when we start to think about tech as hostile in this sense of the term, could it be that the call is coming from inside the house? That in fact the tech industry is facilitating and building hostile tech. Now, as I mentioned, my background is as a lawyer and a historian and not someone who builds or manages technology. And I can understand that if you're a builder of things, it can be very frustrating to constantly have to deal with critics. But in my defense, I would say that as a lawyer, I'm constantly required to think about systems and how they work. I spend a lot of time thinking about how rules incentivize or sanction certain kinds of behavior. And I'd argue that there's lots to be gained if people who are involved in the design and the commission of technology also start to think in that same way. So, of course, I should say, that taking ethical advice from a lawyer may require something of a leap of faith. I think it's obligatory that I make fun of my profession before I go too much further. But what I would say is too often creators of technology have gotten into a position where they're not protecting users from hostile tech, but in fact exposing them to it. And we need to think carefully about how we can get out of that kind of pattern of behaviour. I don't want to give the ending away here, but I think a human rights lens has a lot to commend it. It helps us to see users as people with dignity, and it can be a useful frame of reference to avoid tech becoming hostile and hostile in the practice of power against the vulnerable. So the too long didn't read version of this talk, for those who are in that mindset, is that makers of technology need to think about their work as being for people, not users, and that human rights can play a really helpful role in the process of design to achieve that goal. So before I get to that conclusion, I wanted to start by looking at where we've come from. And I wanted to talk about how the technology industry and the regular visits to the Valley itself to map out what was going on, do some research for their show. They described the Valley in an interview as a place where hippie culture of San Francisco has run headlong into rampant capitalism. And one of the main characters, of course, is this man, Gavin Belson, the slick and ruthless CEO of a Google-like company called Hooli. And the best line of the whole series, in my view, is from one of his many pep talks to staff, in which he declares, "I don't know about you people, but I don't want to live in a world where someone else makes the world a better place better than we do." And I would say the Silicon Valley and the tech industry more generally has long been associated with a kind of upbeat, self-actualizing capitalism, that making money was perfectly congruent with making good technology. And this is perhaps best encapsulated in an essay written in 1995 called The Californian Ideology. It was published by Richard Barbrook and Andy Cameron, and the authors describe a burgeoning political philosophy centered on achieving individual freedom through the natural laws of the market, of technological progress and the free market, Now, that essay is over 25 years old, but it holds up remarkably well, and I'd encourage you to go and look it up and have a read. We still have many Gavin Belsons who walk among us, who are interested in the transformative nature of technology, but less interested in who might be impacted by their creative destruction. The Gavin Belsons of the world aren't concerned by market fundamentalism as being a driving force in the production of technology. So while we're talking about this, I wanted to break down this ideology into a few different components and talk about them in more detail. One of the driving forces, I think, is an idea of data positivism. It's a belief that the world is knowable, therefore predictable and able to be manipulated and influenced. As Eric Schmidt says here, with enough data, virtually any challenge facing humanity can be solved. So the more data you hold, the greater your capacity to engage in social engineering, which justifies collecting a lot of data. The second kind of principle, I think, that underpins this thinking is a commitment to design evangelism, that good design is a solution to all problems, even ones that are politically and philosophically complex. That engineering is the driving force in solving humankind's problems. And where this gets us is a kind of technological utopianism, that the progress of technology represents the progress of society, that the problem is not the form of technology, but rather that it's not advancing quick enough. The miracle of humanity, then, is our capacity to create technology. Now, these concepts all sound rational, scientific, empirical, objectively sensible. It sounds a bit like Enlightenment thinking after the dark ages of the analog universe. What I'd say is these concepts have cultural and political contexts, and we ignore that at our peril. Together, they create a cultural dynamic in which makers of technology ultimately see users as people that technology does things to, that makers of technology are almost godlike, omnipotent, obscure, inscrutable, and technology is then made for and imposed upon individuals rather than thinking collaboratively about how those experiences how those who experience the impacts of technology can be involved in the process of creating it. Now, many people know Melvin Kranzberg's first law of technology, that technology is neither inherently good nor bad, and nor is it neutral. But the one that I think is overlooked is actually his sixth law of technology, which is technology is a very human activity, and so is the history of technology. Rather than being an objective pursuit based on reason, technology is made and influenced by power and the messy problems of politics. Too often we assume that the job of technologists is to put on a magic show rather than think about how to empower users of what they build. And this is how I would argue we've arrived in a world in which hostile tech is made by people, sometimes with good intentions, often with good intentions, but it has disastrous consequences for those who are using it. Now, we can see this happening everywhere. Digital technology has invaded our physical and psychological spaces, often without our consent, sometimes without our knowledge. It's created a market for our innermost thoughts and desires, in which privacy violations are the norm, while leaving many of us feeling unsatisfied and alone. It feels like a place in which we're groomed for endless consumption, where we're incentivized to spend time on device. The parameters of public debate are set by unaccountable social media platforms. And if you can't find a sense of common truth, you're pushed to extremes. It's a place where governments spend time surveilling us and working out ways to lower our expectations of what they should do. Many people now use technology or have it used on them in ways that are actively hostile. Now, there's plenty of examples of this. The first kind of set I wanted to talk about is hostile tech created and used by governments. Skynet's an example of that, where an assassination program was designed to target people in the tribal areas of Pakistan and then identified as a targeted journalist who was covering the issues, including talking with those tribal leaders, and identified him as a target for assassination. Robodebt is, of course, another example that's well known to Australian audiences, where an algorithm was used to assign debts to thousands, tens of thousands of people who were some of the most vulnerable in our community that were ultimately reversed. The Aadhaar and Digital Identity Project in India, but in other parts of the world, often by design excludes certain people from accessing essential government services. Then there's hostile tech used by companies, of which there's plenty of this. Cambridge Analytica in the middle there is an obvious example where data is harvested from people without them knowing and then used to manipulate elections and the like. Amazon, of course, famously created a resume sorting algorithm that only produced male candidates for particular jobs. And then, of course, there's a plethora of diet and weight loss apps that really serve to be a front for data harvesting. And then there's that very sweet spot for both the industry and government, which is where their interests meet. And there's a huge amount of hostile tech here. So, school surveillance programs, companies that often these markets are vendor driven is what I should say as well. So often companies then come to government departments and try and sell them things to solve their problems. School surveillance is one. So actively surveilling students' use of the web in order to supposedly guard against risks. Facial recognition technology has been posed in Australia for the use of taking the role in schools, which I think is deeply alarming. Project Maven, in which companies like Google ultimately, which was withdrawn, but then Microsoft collaborate to help optimize the use of drone technology and the artificial intelligence surrounding using unmanned drones. And then also a company like Palantir, which essentially pitches itself as a data analytics firm for government to better surveil, monitor, and police citizens in all sorts of negative ways. Now, I would argue that all of this technology that we're talking about in these products have worked exactly as intended, and they've been actively hostile to users or those it was used upon. And perhaps the only exception there is Cambridge Analytica, which technically did violate the terms of service of Facebook, but I think it's a bit rich to draw too fine a distinction between a company using Facebook to engage in mass data harvesting when the entire purpose of Facebook is to harvest data. Now, I'm not sure everyone who was working on these projects was seeking to make hostile technology, even if you give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm sure some of them thought that they may have been advancing progressive causes. But For makers of technology, unfortunately, I don't think intentions can be used to shirk responsibility. Lawrence Lessig reminds us that code is made, never found. And so when it comes to intention, as a lawyer in me would say, it's a standard of strict liability, or as Stafford Beer likes to remind us, the purpose of a system is what it does. So too often, the hostile outcomes of technology are portrayed as being unintended, but I don't think that's good enough. What matters with technology is outcomes, and decisions made by designers of technology are policy decisions. You can't simply assume that such problems sit above your pay grade, or aren't for engineers to discuss, or aren't something that should be incorporated into the design process. I appreciate that these problems and tackling them might require different skills and different knowledge and learning, but it's not a reason to avoid contending with them. And part of the reason why I think this is such an important discussion is that makers of technology have a very special role to play. They often sit between the powerful and the vulnerable and make and enable the facilitation between the two. And in other words, they have a choice, and they're in the position to make a choice about how such work will be done and what kind of standards will be upheld. And it's a position of power that must be used wisely. Now, resistance to the kind of market fundamentalism of the Californian ideology is not only possible, I think it's really interesting to see it currently taking root among the tech industry itself. It's really exciting to see workers in the tech industry talking about their work, not just in terms of what's possible technically, but also what they have a social license to do. And we're dependent more so than ever on tech workers speaking out about how technology is facilitating warfare, militarization of borders and surveillance of migrants and insecure work. For example, in the case of Facebook, I think it's really telling that we learned from a whistleblower about how the company's business model functions by taking a light touch when it comes to content moderation. And as a result, millions of people are put at risk and social systems are put at risk when elections are rigged or military juntas engage in various kinds of misconduct using platforms like Facebook, as in the case of Burma. Now, to that end, I note one of the titles of the sessions later today, which I love, is How Not to Make the News. And I think that's a really important guiding principle. I'm not even cynical about that. I think it's a good way to think about how you're building, making, and commissioning technology. It's useful for security purposes, of course, but I think it's also useful for political purposes. And even if you're comfortable with your reputational standing as an organisation, you don't think you're going to make the news like Facebook does for its various scandals, I'd also encourage you and invite you to think then how you might be able to take a leadership role within the industry and start talking about these questions and lead by example. And to put it perhaps slightly differently, I'm not sure you actually have a choice. The growing pile of tech scandals means that makers of technology can no longer expect to shirk responsibility for the consequences of their policy decisions. Lawmakers are far less inclined to accept cowboy behaviour among the industry, and courts are increasingly disinclined to tolerate substandard and disingenuous tech programs when put in place by governments and companies. The public as well, I think, interestingly, even in a very short time, are starting to see these issues quite differently. So it may be a matter of reform or be reformed. And I think if you're in the crowd today, you may want to, you're a very good candidate. I'd invite you to think about how you can take a leadership role in this particular moment. So implementing a human rights approach and advocating for it as an industry standard is a very useful way to do this. Now, you might ask, what do I mean by human rights? Well, principally, I'm referring to instruments that were largely created in the post-World War II period. And this was generally in response to the horrors of industrialized warfare and the Holocaust. The world came together, various nation states, and started to draft instruments to make sure that that wouldn't happen again. And that included documents relating to civil and political rights, like the covenants, economic and social rights, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also more specific rights, like the rights of refugees contained in the Refugees Convention. That's an important place to start. But I think human rights has a longer history, perhaps in both directions from that particular period. Looking back in time, the ideas can trace their origin to the Declaration of Independence. And what I'd say about that is one of my favourite founding fathers, who's often neglected in the history books, I think, to the degree that he deserves, he doesn't get enough attention to the degree that he deserves, is Thomas Paine. He was actually interested in a broader conception of rights and a big supporter of the Declaration of Independence, and it's contentious, but arguably was a drafter. But one of the things he was talking about at that particular time was how civil and political rights are critically important, but that economic inequality was a driver and a motivator for political corruption. So actually, if you look back, you can trace the modern idea of the universal basic income back to the writings of Thomas Paine, who was talking about the need to redistribute wealth in order to protect the integrity of civil and political rights. And moving forward, I would say past the World War II period, there's also an abundance of post-colonial movements for independence in places like Africa in the second half of the 20th century, which helped shape our understanding of rights. Those movements cast a different light on what these rights meant in the context of freedom and oppression in colonial societies and the need for self-determination. So it's a rich field full of history, and there's more to it than just the documents, but the documents are a great place to start. And indeed, there are documents that are also specific to industrial settings and corporate settings that I think can be useful. The Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, for example, is a good one. This document suggests that there's no need to wait for governments to implement systems of human rights, including for respect, but also for remedies and accountability, that companies can do this themselves. And it may be a document you might want to look at and think about how you can implement in the work that you do. Now, what I'd say is there are criticisms that can be made of human rights without a doubt. Many people think they're too individualistic, that the field is too focused on form over substance. But I think it's a great place for the tech industry to start. It's vastly superior, I would say, to the amorphous idea of ethics, which too often focuses on what people who are in the room designing technology think is right. A human rights framework instead encourages us to see people as rights holders rather than raw material to be exploited by nudging, manipulating, cajoling them into a particular kind of behaviour. It means an ethical approach doesn't need to be created from scratch. Rather, human rights as a field has often contended with situations where rights conflict or where a right might sit at odds with a public policy approach. So these kinds of questions have been deliberated and thought about and resolved in different ways over the history of human rights law and human rights practice. So it requires human rights, not just formal equality, but also freedom from indirect and direct discrimination. And that has implications for how you might audit and engage with the metrics produced by technology. Human rights protects the right to privacy, but also the right to public participation. And in the age of data harvesting and state surveillance, I think it can be really useful to think about how these rights are not mutually exclusive, but in fact are mutually reinforcing. And human rights practice acknowledges that no right is absolute, but it's a matter of working out how those incursions on human rights are justified, whether they're necessary and proportionate, which is a useful way of thinking through when individual rights might conflict with a public policy for the majority. By thinking about design through this lens, we're encouraged to create products that focus on empowerment, on public participation and accountability. So to do that, I think requires that we treat people as having agency and dignity and curiosity and a desire to shape their own destiny. If we want to build a world defined by fairness rather than exploitation, we need to advocate with and on behalf of those who are furthest from the levers of power and influence, those who are most vulnerable, to amplify their voices, to invite them to talk about how to define and pursue justice, and to create a society that genuinely works for the benefit of all. So what I would say is, instead of the idea of data positivism, which I talked about before, perhaps we should be aiming for data minimization and encouraging designers to draw a distinction between functional data, like technical metadata and the like, and user data, like personal information. Because functional data facilitates the functioning of the web and tech products, but personal information facilitates the functioning of surveillance capitalism. By enshrining an idea of data minimization at an engineering level, this could prevent micro-targeting, abolish the secondary data market, and require businesses to abandon data extractivism for profit. So instead of design evangelism, perhaps we have to contend with the limitations of a design approach for certain kinds of users, that in fact there's a diversity of users for whom designing things might actually be a problem. We need services that aim not just to serve the average user, but perhaps the most vulnerable or the non-standard user. So if a service or device can offer locational data about a user and it cannot be switched off, we might want to think about the implications of that for someone who, say, is a woman seeking to flee a violent partner, or a journalist who's trying to talk to a source and doesn't want that to be known. Problem solving for users in this context might involve less design rather than more, and prioritizing things like transparency, customization, and security quite differently. And lastly, I would say, instead of being utopian about technology, we need to build in accountability for when things don't go to plan. And that involves talking to users, testing products really carefully before using them, asking questions, and listening to the answers about how users understand their needs. Accountable decision-making requires that users understand the rules and can have a say in how they are made, which is the basis of the right to public participation. It's about making sure users have a frictionless access to a remedy when they're harmed, rather than offloading the responsibility of pursuing a complaint onto them. If the purpose of a system is what it does, built-in accountability creates a system that's interested in fixing itself, not ignoring or downplaying harm. Now, I have what Antonin Gramsci would describe a pessimism of the intellect and an optimism of the will. I'm very excited about the potential of technology. I'm no means anti that, and I think it's important to remember. I think it's really important to remember that technology could work differently, that the internet and the web could be a place that is quite different to what it currently is. It could be a world of liberation and empowerment that helps us overcome some of our biggest challenges. It could be a place where we come to know more meaningfully some of the problems that plague society, things like inequality. It could be a place where efficiency and automation mean we do less work rather than more. It could be a place in which we engage in meaningful conversations about where we want society to go with our communities and our societies. But we need to stop socializing the consequences of hostile tech if we are to build a digital world like that. I started with talking about how the call might be coming from inside the house, that in fact, we might be involved as an industry in potentially creating hostile technology. And I wanted to return to another movie reference to suggest where I think we should go. And that is that we need to expose the magic of advanced technology. We need to be the thinking people who pull back the curtain on how power works. So much of the discussions around ethics and technology are really just discussions about politics. They're really just questions about how we think about power and how it should be distributed in society. So to that end, where I wanted to finish up is, if we are looking for a hero at this particular moment, I would argue we could actually probably do no better than Ned Ludd. Now, you may not know who he is, but he is the leader, fictional, of the Luddites. Now, when we talk about Luddites, we constantly assume that they're reactionaries, they're people who hate technology, who destroyed it because they were anti-progress. But I think there's nothing that could be further from the truth. They're possibly the most maligned historical movement, and we've actually got a lot to learn from them. They were industrial saboteurs of the early 19th century. They were people who were craftsmen, who had worked to make beautiful things, and that role had been overtaken by mechanized forms of production that stripped them of their humanity and dignity. So far from hating technology per se, what they hated was technology that stripped them of their dignity. Frames were hostile, frames that they were smashing as weavers. These frames were hostile to their sense of worth, both economically and spiritually, I would say, and consigning them to a life of abject misery. The Luddites organised in the only way that they knew how, which was to engage in workplace agitation through riot, and eventually smashing the frames that had symbolized the lack of their humanity that came with the Industrial Revolution. And they smashed these frames because they represented how their lives had been made hellish. Now, I would say, like the Luddites, we should be seeking to smash technology that is hostile by design. That doesn't mean we have to be against technology or anti it. We have to make sure that the technology works for everyone and doesn't consign people to lives of misery. And that's our role as activists, as regulators, as designers, and as users. Instead of being utopian about technology, we need to situate it within its political and economic context and apply critical scrutiny to its creation. And that way we can find ways for it to be subject to principles of democratic governance. So next time you're building or designing a bit of technology, ask yourself, what would Ned Ludd think of this? Thank you.